Good day and welcome to the School for New Writers Teacher Lounge, where we take a Q&A from the School for New Writers group on Fanfiction. My name is PycoPie, and we are joined today by Dark Lord Comp.
Hello.
Piercing Sight.
What's up?
Gary Oak.
Hello.
And Penstroke.
Hello.
So, just a little bit of forewarning, there might be some inconsistencies with the recording. My power has turned off once today, and we've lost the recording, so we have extra backups now going. We just might have some issues, but hopefully we won't. So the way this works is that we will read our, a question out and say who wrote that question to us. We will give one person will be a primary responder, and then we'll have a little bit of a round table. So I'm going to kick it off. Wicked SL Dragon asks about what types of tools, tricks, techniques, and advice we have on conveying tone and emotion. How much emotion is too much? How would you convey feeling and emotion to your readers? And when you should show emotion in certain places. Personally, I find that emotion is something that works differently depending on the emotion. So, for instance, if you were trying to make someone afraid, you might add in some extra atmospheric cues to prompt that fear in your reader a little bit, prime it, and then you can have the character react to it, and so they can help help that fear in the character resonate with the reader, so that there's a mutual understanding there. For flirting, having little cues, where like a character looks up and accidentally meets the eyes of their crush, that can be the kind of emotional cue that can help people tune in. One of the big things with emotion not having too much emotion is don't repeat yourself too much. Repeating yourself a little and in different ways can work sometimes to help that connection, but a lot of times if you start repeating yourself too much, the reader will look at it and say, I get it, this person's afraid, this person's in love, that's great, let's move it on, kiss, they want some action. So don't include emotion to the detriment of the progression of the story. Don't just have scenes that are just there for an emotional connection. And try to have emotion be something that is led into, in terms of like, try to make a connection between the character and the reader. One way to do that is by having emotions and having the character's emotions be reflected in the reader. But it's kind of this weird back and forth chicken and the egg kind of dealio, where you need to, do a little bit to get that connection and then do something else, then go back. Something else, did I just talk myself into a corner? Quite possibly. I think there was something else I covered in the previous recording that I forgot, but
It shall be lost to time and space.
Information shall be lost. So what do you guys think on this topic?
Writing making the connection, as you said, that's actually probably one of my biggest weaknesses as a writer, and it's something I've been trying to overcome, because action doesn't mean anything if the readers have to be invested enough in the characters and what's at stake in order for action to matter. Like, you can have the most epic, amazing action sequence in your story, but if they don't care about your characters, it's just boring and a total waste of time. Yeah, it's Michael Bay, and you don't want to be Michael Bay. Michael May, because it's ponies.
That's horrible. One thing I would say about really trying to convey tone and emotion is to focus on tone. The variance and length of sentences can really help to draw out a longer moment, the dramatic moment where the sentences may be more flowy, or more compound sentences there's more description. Time seems to slow down in those instances because of the fact that the author is giving so many details, and you don't want to overload the reader, but at the same time, giving something can gain a lot of meaning just by the author focusing in on it, and at the same time, to go to the other end of the spectrum, if you want to kind of have the blood pumping, you want to have things being scary or quick or actiony or that kind of tone, then it's shorter sentences, it's snappier things, it's the character shouting at each other, not monologuing about why they hate their parents.
Another thing
that's very similar to one moment. That's very similar to how you elicit emotion with music. Certain tones definitely read your story out loud, and the parts you're working on out loud to see what kind of emotion they convey. And if you're really trying to hit hard with a wide variety of emotional cues, have someone else read it and ask them, how when they read it, how just the cadence makes them feel, because that can be a big effect.
Yeah, another thing to go along with that is...
Sorry. But
Sorry.
I was just going to reference the writing guide really quick. Like if you go to in FimFic, if you go to writing guide and click pacing, then it talks specifically about like sentence size and how that flows and how that creates either tension or calming or whatever. So that's it.
Yeah.
You can,
Further on that topic, though, is furthermore on that topic is the choice of words in the sentence. Diction is really important, and like I always understood, yes, words have certain connotations, and you want to use the correct word for things, not just based on what the word means in the context. There's many different ways to say the same thing, but some word choices are more specific than others. But they also have certain positive or negative or neutral connotations. And one thing that really got me to pay attention to that is poetry, because poetry, you really have to pick every single word in a poem, because a poem can be like 20 words or less, and each of those word choices has to be perfect, not only in just how they sound, but what the reader associates to and how specific that word is, and that will really help you craft the tone on top of the size of the sentences.
Yeah, and like there are certain words that carry a certain emotional connotation to it, and so you have to go, okay, so I'll use this word instead of this one, because the vocabulary and the phrasing can completely change the way that it looks like it's being talked about. Like you can tell if something's being talked about fondly or if it's being talked about with spite, just the way that it's being described.
I mean, even a very base level example is there was a smell, there was an aroma, there was an odor. Each one of those, each one of those really carry a neutral good and respectively bad connotation, but even though they all generally refer to something you smell.
Yeah, that's
because odor is a more neutral word. What's really funny, Pen, is I was going to talk about like a bad smell too, because like you can also like, is it smelly? Is it stinky? Is it pungent? Like that pungent is a really strong word.
Yeah, pungent's better.
Or is
than
it
odor.
Noxious? Like, is it noxious?
Noxious, yeah.
Noxious is another good one. So, like, you really have to figure out which one of those words best suits your sentence. And this can make writing really difficult when you're trying to do that with every single word, but it really does shine through and make your prose just stand out if you are able to do that properly. And don't make it look like you swallowed a thesaurus. You actually really have to know what you're doing with this and experiment.
Yeah, you have to. Well, I recommend, like, for getting that vocabulary, reading a ton of books that have very expressive writing in it, and then writing a ton of really expressive writing. Like, try poetry. And then once you get good at kind of emulating those feelings, you can bring that and carry it over into your writing.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so
I think we can move on to the next question. This
Yes.
one comes from a sir not appearing in this fic, and it person of interest asks, who is not appearing in this fic, what exactly is foreshadowing, and when is it appropriate to use foreshadowing? And are there times when it could be detrimental to the story, such as when it is used in excess? Yes. It's like, foreshadowing is, just to give the exact definition, or at least what it is in my brain, is when you are a phrase, a description, or some element of your story is hinting to a future event, a future character, or a future item that will be relatively important to the plot. And it is generally appropriate to use foreshadowing. Shorter fics, it's harder to pull it off because, of course, it's a shorter fic. You don't have that much headroom to foreshadow something before it actually happens. But in the longer form stories, it can be something that brings the reader into a much greater engagement. And it's much more important to stories that rely on a heavier sense of mystery, such as crime or solving a great riddle of the Sphinx or what have you. It, however, can be really detrimental to the story if you are laying out too many clues that your readers figure out what the great reveal is well before it's supposed to happen. But there are ways to really kind of address this, and one of the favorites I have is to kind of have it, there's two. Sorry, yeah, tongue-tied. Is that one, you want to use red herrings. If you're foreshadowing, go ahead and also foreshadow things that point to other endings, so that there is a sense of mystery of, oh, okay, there's a gun and there's a knife. The guy was stabbed and the guy was shot. Oh God, what actually killed him and what came after? That is a horrible example, but it makes the point.
Yeah,
And
there's a difference between revealing what's going to happen in your story and making it a question, engaging the reader. If the reader can just figure out what's going to happen, it's not that engaging, because it's like, oh, so later on this is going to happen, and you're not giving me any reason to believe otherwise. Whereas if it's a question, it's like, is this going to happen, or is it going to be something else? Is this a red herring? Is this not? It really helps reader engagement and interest. And then big thing about foreshadowing is that you want it has its greatest effect when the reader just figures it out about the same time as the characters, and then you get that aha moment, and then it's immediately reinforced. But there's none of this downtime where you know what's going to happen, and you're just kind of like, come on, let's get to it, and then go to the next thing.
Yeah, and the red herring doesn't have to be a different. The red herring doesn't have to be a different clue. It could simply be a misinterpretation of a correct clue, and you can use that, and that will give the reader a lot more to think about, and the reader will be going, oh, wait, is it this or is this? I don't see how that connects to that. And then they have to come up with a whole bunch of their own theories, and that's why like cliffhangers would be so fantastic.
Yeah, and that's really how characters can play into foreshadowing. Is foreshadowing doesn't just have to be the descriptions, the elements, there was a gun on the table, or all that stuff, or there are storm clouds on the horizon. It can be how the characters are interpreting things, and characters can interpret them wrong at the initial exposure to the elements.
If you want a tour de force of what we've just been talking about, reread the Harry Potter series with that in mind, like with all of what we just said in mind, specifically the first 4 books.
Well,
yes.
That's assuming you have already read the Harry Potters and you thus know the grand conspiracy of it all.
That's why I said reread.
Yeah,
because
something that the Harry Potter books
with that in mind.
Well,
yeah.
Some people could have just read the first 4, and you're just telling them to reread the first 4 without really reading the last 3.
Something else that the Harry Potter books did well, and that is reflected a lot in techno thrillers and a lot of other thrillers, is that a lot of times the characters, they have a good functional knowledge, but they don't necessarily know everything, or they're not exposed to all the information. Tom Clancy's done this before, where he'll have a character in like the first third of a book who's from a different perspective in a situation where the other characters that you're following aren't present, and a lot of times that character will die or be captured or will wander off and come back later. But that perspective gives information that raises extra questions, that then it's not that so much that they're giving answers for later, it's that they're raising extra questions, and then when the other characters are going around, they don't realize it, but these questions are being added to because of this extra information that's added, and it's being foreshadowed, but the character doesn't even necessarily know that something is going to happen all the time. And so you get this weird situation where it's a lot of extra suspense and a lot of extra thriller element comes about. And it's a really good, it's a little bit harder to do, to have your reader know something that the character doesn't, but it makes it a lot easier because if your character has all this functional knowledge in this one particular area and you can't really give that information to that character, but you can give it to the reader without the character going, oh, I can put everything together now, then when they find out that information, then they can explain it. And when you get that information as a reader, that puzzle piece falls into place. Hey, look, now you're like, oh, now that this information, this question that I have has been answered, it leads to this greater conclusion at the same time the character is receiving that. And so then that foreshadowing is followed up on with the answer, which the reader receives at the same time as the character, and then the plot progresses immediately. And it's very rewarding and very interesting because I talk a lot about brain activity when I talk about writing, and that really helps the reader. You know, they're asking questions, they're answering questions, they're connecting with the character, the plot is progressing. A lot of little different things are happening at the same time, and that's really interesting to a lot of readers.
I think the word you're looking for there in most of what you just said is oblique.
That works.
Say that
It's
again.
Like, oblique. I think that's the word you're looking for to describe a lot of what you just said. You know, don't answer a question, just ask another question.
Yeah.
It's like, you know, when someone's being oblique in conversation, they never actually answer you directly. They just ask you another question and carry on the conversation that way. It's really difficult to be oblique. But
it's like, you want to go to the movies? Well, what movie would you want to see? I don't know. I'd like to see that one. What about going to the... Yeah, no, I'm making a horrible
like
example.
Ron Swanson, like you've seen Ron Swanson's like, the only kind of witness I like to be is a hostile one. I answer every question with a question.
yeah,
And it's like him being interviewed like by a lawyer, and he's just answering all of them with really terrible questions, and it's just hilarious. But
yeah, that's one form of oblique dialogue right there.
But be
Just
careful
used for
because that can
comedy.
get really frustrating as well.
Oh, it can. It can. That's the thing. You got to be careful with being oblique. If you do it oblique for the sake of being oblique, you're just going to make people angry.
Yeah,
It's like using semicolons for the sake of using semicolons. That makes me mad.
Yeah, but yeah, you know. So I think we covered that.
Can I talk about my experience with foreshadowing? Because Pico, we talked about this on the Lost recording. Rip. It was about a novel I'm working on, and it's not pony related, but it's something I have been working on for a couple of years now, almost. And basically, a big point of the book is to send a message, and that message is told through build up to a very big reveal at the end. And the thing is, it's about an issue in society, I guess, that a lot of people don't know very much about, and people who don't really know much about it are hopefully going to get educated on the way because of how I foreshadow and set it up. And then when it's revealed, it all makes sense. Like, oh, there's no way else this could have ended. But someone who is actually educated on the issue, when they were workshopping the story in one of my writing classes, she read like the 4th chapter and only the 4th chapter with a brief description of what happened in the first 3 chapters, and she figured out the twist based on that chapter alone, which didn't have that many clues in it. It was just all implicit.
Was it a personal connection? Like she recognized that from her own experience?
Someone in her family was going through the same thing, or a similar thing that the main character was dealing with, and she's like, "Oh, is this person so and so?" And I said, "Wow, yes. How did you figure it out?" And she told me, like, "Oh, my cousin's."
One of the things I really like with your story is that you take a lot of authors will do certain things to benefit the story. In this case, a lot of authors will do certain things to give their character broader appeal because, let's face it, a lot of people, you know, they might be decent, fine people, but it's not like you really connect with them. With a story character, who's the main character, you really need that connection, and a lot of people will add in certain elements to, you know, as authors, to help that character connect with a broader audience. The interesting thing about your story is that you didn't just do that to connect to a broader audience. It actually relates to the character's personal challenge and that big reveal. So when you read it, you're like, oh, this is this, and you're like, oh, it's not just that. It's not just, you know, there for the character. That's actually part of the plot, and you don't realize it. And so when that reveal happens, it's very engaging. Something else you were talking about was that the personal connection for a lot of people. with foreshadowing, you can include a lot of information that people who are slightly more on the ball with that topic might start making connections more than normal, and that's okay. You want to have it so that the broader audience reaches the conclusions at a certain time, but it's okay to have some information that people who are a little bit more on the ball will make those connections earlier and come to the correct conclusion. A lot of times that's okay because they're not certain if you are actually leading to that, because with foreshadowing, you are, a lot of authors don't necessarily do it properly, and so a lot of professionals will see something and say, "Oh, I bet it's this," but I'm not sure because that's kind of technical. I don't know if that author would understand that. But what you're talking what you were talking about is very similar to a good example of this is suicide. A lot of times, before a person decides on suicide, they suddenly become a lot happier. And they suddenly become a lot happier because they've made a decision as to how to affect their life in what they see as a positive way. And so, because they've reached a decision, because there's something they can do, they feel more positive, and so you see that change. Well, a lot of people have had experience with this. A lot of people know about this information now. So if you have a character who's depressed and going through that kind of thing, whether it's a side character or main character, that kind of cue will alert a lot of people, and they'll start making those connections, but they're not quite sure because maybe there's something else going on in the story they don't know about.
So to give a bit more of a specific example, because I was really vague earlier, the story is basically about this 12-year-old girl's dream, and like that's revealed right away. That's not at all the thing, because she goes into all these different worlds and has to solve these problems, and they all yield a key. For example, one of the chapters involves a house of mirrors, and she really hates mirrors, and another chapter is kind of like Toy Story meets Small Soldiers, where she's transformed into like a Barbie doll, and she has to fight off an army of invading like GI Joes and dinosaurs and all that stuff. And all of that has a very specific purpose. Like there's even one scene where she sees herself as a baby, like in a vision / flashback, and she's wrapped in a blue blanket. That has a meaning too. And someone who's educated in the big reveal might have already picked out what the reveal is based on what I just said, but most people won't really know until they look back and reflect on it. And that's the important thing I'm getting at with foreshadowing. Yes,
we will restart off with Piercing Sight. Go Piercing Sight, go quickly before power fails again.
Okay, I'm going quickly. Okay. So the question asked by Sir Not Appearing in This Fic is, how can you determine whether a given character is truly needed in the story, or if one you have already included should be cut out? So this goes to the basic question of what is essential for your story to have, what's too much, what's too little. And for me, it's really just figuring out what is required to not just tell the story, but to get the emotion of your story and the right connections with the right characters, and like whatever you need to portray in your story that will help the story to progress and will help the readers to feel a certain emotional connection. That is what should be included. Anything more than that is just fluff, and you can really cut that out, purple prose or whatever. And so, like, characters are exactly the same as any other element of your fic. Is they need to contribute in some way, whether that contribution is directly to the storyline or whether it's directly to revealing a certain personality trait in a certain character, or whether it's like creating an emotional ambience or something like that. So if you wanted to create the ambience that someone is in a really rough and tough kind of area, you might want to have some background flat characters that look rough and tough or talking rough and tough things, or a drunk dude like being a jerk to someone or whatever it may be. Or if you want to show a personality trait of a certain character and how they interact with other characters without destroying their relationship with your main characters, you'll bring in a background character that will interact with them really quickly, and then you'll reveal that personality trait through that interaction. And if that personality trait is important to, say, the progression of your story, then not only will it be revealed there, but it will also be used to interact with the main characters, or to cause certain things to happen, or to be like one of the reasons something happens. And so it's all about what is essential in telling your story and getting the emotional connection, like the feeling across that you want to give to the reader. And so it's kind of difficult to pinpoint an exact thing, but for me, it's the progress of the story and the feeling of the story. Those two things are what are needed. Once you've included everything for that, cut everything else out and you're good.
To basically expand on what you said, you really do have to know the complexion of your story and what truly is and isn't needed. And one thing, like this is more of a slight bit of a tangent, but I swear it is relevant, is very few authors on fanfiction actually write their entire story out and edit it, at least to the point where it's second draft and only needs one polishing pass before it's ready to go up, before they start posting the first chapter. Because in a longer piece especially, there's going to be a lot of extraneous characters or a lot of characters that should be there or need fleshing out or what have you, and you don't really know that until you've written your whole story out, set it aside, and then had the time to look at the whole thing again to really see what's fat and what's not, and what needs to be cut out and what should stay or be expanded on. And that's the biggest downfall of fan fiction versus published writing, because published writing goes through all this before the book hits the shelf, obviously, and has been through many, many filters. And fan fiction doesn't really have that. Even if you do diligently edit your work, a lot of people write a chapter, edit the chapter, maybe have a couple chapter buffer, and that's it, but don't have their whole story actually written out. And there's a difference between outlining the heck out of your story and then writing a few chapters and posting them versus actually writing the story. There is no substitute for actually writing the darn thing out.
Two things on that. One is you do sometimes see that happen with in professional writing with multiple book series where
Yes.
hey, in this book this character just doesn't come up. But that's easier to do in a multi-series thing. It's easier to do if like in a sequel you leave out a character. One of the big things that you can do when you go through and do the first draft of your story, look back. A big thing is to ask what questions you have posed to your readers. What are some of the issues in the story, and if a certain character just really isn't relevant to any of the plot points that you've worked on, or brings up a plot point that you just don't finish, maybe you don't need that character, and then you have to look at, well, what's the role of that character in the story? It's like, well, this character really adds a lot of humor, maybe I need to work them into the plot. So that's one thing you can do, is instead of just removing them, is find out their place in a role. But you might have something like, this character's there for a lot of comic relief, but I really wanted to include him more in the story. So if I combine him with this other character, he's relevant to the story and the comic relief. And a lot of authors will do that. They'll combine characters rather than just straight out cutting them, because they had a reason for them to be there in the first place.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would add to that an important thing for whether a character needs to be there or not is, do they offer at least a variant on perspective from the main characters? Do they see things a little bit differently, or do they have insights the other character doesn't? And the other thing is, and this touches on what Gary and others were saying earlier, is that even if you end up having the character, not cutting them out completely, every character doesn't have to be in every scene, and you don't have to be accounting for everyone all the time beyond saying they were in the other room. Because trying to juggle all the characters at all the time is what leads to confusing dialogue, slower pacing than you might desire, and other such things like that. And some of the best moments do come out when you have two characters that are interacting very directly at one another, and how they line up and also clash.
Yeah, I'd say that all works.
Yep. And I think we're starting to get a little bit into the next question for Piercing Sight as well.
All right.
He asked many questions.
Yes. Also, sir, not appearing in this fic. How can you balance out 3 or more characters in a conversation such that none of them are uncharacteristically quiet or talkative, or turning them into talking heads? So, dialogue writing is
Hard.
hard. Yeah. Just yeah, summarized, it's hard. And the best way to do it is to know what points you want the conversation to hit. Like if you want two characters who are just meeting to have a certain kind of relationship, then you should have some small part of the conversation, even if it's like like 3-sentence exchange that like begins to establish that. But like when it comes to being uncharacteristically quiet or talkative, I don't think there really is a rule about how much a certain character needs to talk or like what it is. Like not every character that is there experiencing the conversation needs to have something to say, but if they say something, it should contribute. And a lot of times you'll want the conversation to be natural, but you don't want it to like go off on a tangent like we do all the time on this like recording. So you want it to be focused on what the story is talking about. And if a character has something to contribute, or if you want a character to say something, or if you want the reader to be aware that a character is there, that character should have something unique based on that character's personality to contribute to the conversation. And not turning them into talking heads, that's also helping characters to react in the conversation.
Yeah,
It's not just having them add things, but it's also having them take away things and be like, wait, he said that, or wait, this is something that's there. Like you want them to be reacting, and you want to have facial expressions. You want them to be like, I don't know, someone slamming their hand down on the table when they get angry, or whatever.
Another smash the cup.
Yeah, I actually have two basic principles to go over here, and these are from different disciplines that will help writing dialogue. Number one is like one thing you learn in theater class, like this is entry-level theater stuff, is every scene has a driver, and you basically make an offer, and then the other person responds with another offer, and that's how you keep. And when the person's making that offer, they're the driver, and you basically kind of need to do that to keep your scene engaging. And in order to write good dialogue, one piece of advice I have is, you know how I talked about write poetry to help with your diction choices. Write scripts, because if you write scripts, they are almost pure dialogue. There is very minimal amounts of anything else other than dialogue in your script, and you have to fill over 100 pages if you're writing a screenplay, and most of that is just dialogue. And yes, there are a lot of action direction, but especially if you're writing for a stage play, you write almost no action directions. It's pretty much all dialogue, and that will also kind of tie back into the last point of helping you cut down characters, because in stage plays you generally have a smaller cast. So that will kind of solve both of these questions for you.
And tying in with that, when you have a scene with more than 3 characters, a lot of times what ends up happening is multiple characters get combined into a role. So you have like a main character who's talking, whose perspective you're following more than the others, and then you might start having people being collapsed. Like someone might be there, you know, like in Romeo and Juliet, you might have Romeo, Juliet, and then other characters in the background. Well, the other background characters, mentally to the reader or to the person watching the play or TV show or movie or whatever, they classify other people in one category. And so you might have 2 opposing sides with, you know, in a rap battle where this person's fan, this other person's fan, and then these 2 people talking. Well, there's, you know, dozens of people there, and you can start adding characteristics like instead of saying a single person was yelling or slamming their hand down, it's a crowd. It's, you know, and this person, and this person did this. And so when you do that, you're effectively cutting down your characters, but you're not actually physically cutting down the characters in your story. But mentally it's easier to keep track of if you view it that way. Another thing to realize is that when you write dialogue, it should sound different than the rest of your story. And that's a big thing that a lot of people don't realize. And so you can have people adding comments, and so the reader's focusing on one thing. You know, they're focusing on this character's perspective, this problem that they're trying to solve. And then this person is adding to the total amount of information. So it doesn't feel like they've been absent. It just feels like the focus is on this topic, which is plays into a little bit with how people view the real world. Because if you're with a group of people and one person's kind of talking less than the others because they're paying more attention, you can do that in a story where it's, you know, everyone, you know, they nod in agreement.
Yeah.
Well, everyone's has an action there, but it's just one simple sentence.
And like going off what you mentioned about how dialogue should sound different from the style of your story. Normally, like if you're doing first person, then like most of your exposition will be in the style of the main character. But you need to have each character that's in your
Yes.
story, they need to have different personalities, and the way they need to speak needs to mirror that personality. Like
Yeah.
if you look at the show, then you know that like even when it comes to like with Rarity, Rainbow Dash, and like Applejack, they all have different accents and different ways of speaking and emphasizing and phrases that they commonly use. Your characters need to do that.
And if you're writing
in a
scripts,
conversation, that's how they add their portion to it. That's what makes it interesting.
and if you're writing scripts, a way to do this where if it's not just straight writing, where if there's a visual element, is to have people have different body language. That's the equivalent. And yeah, it's easier to have that all happen at once. But if there's stuff in the show where someone will reveal something or do something, it'll be a little bit odd. And then like when Rarity turns to look at someone, her head might go up more. And, she might have the raised eyebrow, whereas Rainbow Dash or Pinkie Pie might cock their head. And that kind of change helps distinguish your characters, and when they stand out more, it makes them feel more like they're contributing a personal aspect to the story, as opposed to just everyone nodding in agreement, which is you're classifying everyone as a group. So determining whether you want an action to be more of a group action, whether they're part of a group, or whether you want to specifically draw them out is important. And it can also bleed into this. This is not really foreshadowing, but if you have someone do a slightly different action than everyone else and then start talking, it's a little bit easier for your reader to transition to them. And the transitions are what a lot of people struggle with when they're writing multiple characters being in one scene.
And something else that's not quite been touched on is that when you have three characters talking to one another, something that can help avoid talking heads and also just to keep things going is do mix in some action while these people are talking. It's like sometimes characters will just sit at a table and talk. That's very true. But sometimes it helps if they're doing something else. Like if you have three characters that are working at Sugar Cube Corner, well, if they're taking stuff out of the ovens, if they're mixing batter and all this stuff, if there's something else going on, it helps not only distinguish the characters by just how they're doing their actions, but it also helps break up some of the monotony of trying to juggle 3+ characters discussing something.
Yeah.
A great
And so,
example
like,
of how not to do.
Especially because characters don't really there's no character or person in existence who doesn't do anything when they talk.
Yeah.
If someone is walking and they stop in the middle of the road to make conversation, either like they
have
stop
a mental
everything.
issue.
Like if they stop everything and they're like, "Hello, how are you? I like skateboards," and they're like, "What the fuck?
Want to go skateboard?
Do you
a
want
good
to go skateboards?"
This is kind of going into the next question
yeah, this
too.
is going. There's a
Can I add
balance.
one
That
thing
goes
real
into the next
fast?
question.
A good example of how not to do this is Episode 3 of Star Wars.
Yes.
George Lucas is a big person about having, when he was directing it on his own without feedback from other people who knew what they were doing, is that he had 2 cameras and he had people standing or walking and talking, and that was it. If you compare that to the very beginning of Episode 3, Padme is packing. She's packing her stuff while she's talking. She's doing stuff. It's infinitely better scene compared to the hour or so of people just walking back and forth and talking that happens for the entire rest of the story.
But I love people
I was
walking
about to
around in
say-
CGI
I was about to
hallways.
say, because then you go to the end of Star Wars Episode 3 and Anakin and Obi-Wan are walking around each other going, "You have betrayed the Republic!" And he's like, "In my perspective, the Jedi are evil!"
I know, and they're like having this conversation, like they have a lightsaber battle, but the moment they start speaking, they just stop completely.
And I also like
Because
the fact
talking's
that
not a free action, that's why.
Also, I love the fact that Anakin...
It's not a free action.
grew up with the Jedi for Anakin, who grew up with the Jedi for most of his life, was like, "The Jedi are evil!"
Wow, that was
So
That was
one of
Mickey
the things
Mouse
is
laughter quality
if you
there.
do
Well,
if you
Well,
have
we can actually
actions,
do that now
Disney.
because it's Disney Star Wars now.
yeah, if you have actions going
Mickey
on
Mouse.
throughout the story and then you stop that to focus on the speaking, it also gives more emphasis to what they're talking about, which can help change the emotional mood. It can help really focus the reader on. It's not just about this
Yeah, we're
other
already in
thing
the
that's
next
going on.
question
It
now.
focuses
Yeah, you guys
on the action.
have run over literally half of what I was gonna say.
all right. Go,
Nice
go.
job.
Your turn.
Yeah, Legion Poth IX asks, what is a good way to have dialogue and actions happen simultaneously in a scene without it becoming tiresome to the reader? Specifically, Discord dialogue, as illustrated in the show, like he snaps his fingers and talks and things change around him. That is, it's all about sequencing, in my opinion, because what you have to do there is this does help avoid talking heads. Is you figure out what you want your character to say and what you want your character to do. And remember, when you're writing something, you're reading left to right, and that kind of happens in a more linear fashion. So, say you say something, and then okay, an important action needs to take place here. Then you stop the dialogue, and then you don't need to use a dialogue tag. You just have Discord say a line, and then you just go full stop, same paragraph. Discord performs X action, XYZ happens, and then usually on the same paragraph, you'll have him resume speaking or what have you. And that's kind of how you integrate it together, I would say.
Just because we are talking about Discord, Pinkie Pie, and some of the other characters can be really difficult to write just because when we see them in the show, they're doing a lot of visual gags while they are talking at the exact same time, and you can't get away with that as easily in writing because of as Gary Oak said, there is a linearity to you can't actually have the reader processing what they're saying and the visual gag going on at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
There is certain orders to it, and so people who try to do everything Discord does in those visual gags and whatnot, well, they're visual gags. They don't quite work as well. It's like I've even been accused of this a couple times where Discord gets a little too crazy daisy for written text.
And something you can do, you can pause talking.
Yes,
you can add in pauses where someone's thinking or where you're explaining something to the reader, and so you can have a paragraph that's not talking, and then you can use it to help engage, either start that process, like going, he talks, does something, affects how the character sees the situation, explain that, continue talking, or have them, explain their thought process, and then they do the action, and then it continues talking. It can help the whole thing flow better together, but trying to force the action in the middle of the speaking can work sometimes if it's a smaller action, but the more significance it has on what's going on, unless it's kind of like a foreshadowed big reveal or it's this kind of catch you off guard moment, you generally don't want to have an action in the middle of
a very complex action in the middle of dialogue. If
if you're going to do that, actually pause the dialogue to focus on it because it's important, because it's significant, because it changes something, and then indicate to your reader what that change means, even if it's, tell or show or whatever, it doesn't matter. But by trying to integrate too much of it together, it jumps around and makes it harder for the reader to comprehend, and it makes it flow less smoothly.
Yeah, that's one thing I've noticed is it's also really hard to have multiple instances of dialogue, action, dialogue, action, dialogue, action. Like if it's the same character paragraph, and like if you break it up too many times, it will become tiresome and confusing to the reader, and it's really hard to do well. So you want to break it up like once or twice at most, maybe.
I actually have an example of that from the fic that's I'm almost going to finish a year and a half later. Yay! Not a year and a half, just a half a year later. But during the road home, I had a quick comedy sequence where it's like Discord throws a cinnamon bun to Pinkie Pie football style, and it was entirely there to annoy Applejack, and she responded properly once the sequence is done. It's like, are you two done being stupid? But it became, the dialogue went, and then I had the action as its own paragraph, and then went back to the dialogue, and then I stuck with the dialogue for a significant amount of time thereafter. So it's again kind of further reinforcing the fact that if it's going to be a big action, let it be a big action. Don't make the characters talk over it.
One of the rules that Gary touched on is that if you have a paragraph that's you can either have a paragraph that's mostly speech or mostly action. Either way, you generally, if it's mostly speech, the most action you generally want to have the majority of the time is 2 at most. One at the beginning and one at the end. And you can switch one of those to being in the middle to indicate who's talking, that kind of stuff. But generally, you don't want more than one or two lines, either modifying the dialogue or being on their own for a full paragraph, not like a short paragraph, but a full paragraph of dialogue. If you have a full paragraph of action and you want to include a little bit of dialogue in that, generally you only want one or two lines together for the dialogue. You don't want to split it up too much, as Gary was saying, but that's about the limitations of what you want. There's some rare exceptions if you happen to have something set up perfectly, so a character reacts to something, talks, sees the reaction, and then you have one more action or one more piece of dialogue. But that includes a perfect setup.
Another thing I wanted to add to that is, like, you don't want to partition them too much, because if you have all your dialogue as separate paragraphs and the only thing you have accompanying that dialogue in said paragraphs is said so-and-so or what have you, and all your big narrative paragraphs are just narrative and no dialogue in them, then your story gets a really goopy feeling, kind of like, goopy paint, and you really don't want that. That's actually what my writing used to look like when I was just starting out, and it's like one of the big flags of this guy is really new at writing. And it's fine to start out that way, but then you have to learn how to incorporate them seamlessly together.
Well, I think we've talked that one to the ground. Shall we? We also seem to have lost our dear Dark Lord comp.
And his question is the next one.
Yeah,
he's
so
trying to get back in, but luckily.
well, we can return to the question he had selected, and we can try to keep the ball rolling while he's trying to get back.
All right, it's another one of mine then. It's also asked by Legion Poth 9, and
oh wait, is he back?
Oh,
yeah.
Is he?
You see,
Alright.
we just had to tempt fate.
Yeah, we did.
Yep.
All right,
No,
there we
my
go.
internet dropped.
It's your turn for the
Oh,
question.
you
Yeah.
can continue. I'll just steal your next one. Just
No,
continue
it's
answering
actually
this
your
one.
turn.
No, like we've arrived on your
Oh.
question now.
It was
Man.
the timing was
Okay.
perfect.
Yeah.
Okay. So least.
Uh-oh.
And
What?
Robot.
no, don't die.
Do you want me to just go into mine while his internet stabilizes?
You could,
Let's
yeah.
give him a second. Robot, Dark Lord comp, please recompute.
Are you there?
am
Respawn.
I still here?
Respawn.
Hello.
Oh, yes, you're still here.
Kind of.
Yeah.
You're still robotic. And
Slightly.
he's gone.
And he's dead.
Rip.
He died.
All right, I'll just go into my next one
Yeah,
then.
go on
Will
to
you
yours.
reconnect? All right, so again, this is asked by Legion Poth 9, and he says, why is there this obsession over telling an original story when originality was thrown out in ancient times? For example, many Shakespearean plays were just based off Greek plays. How might we return to an original telling of a story? That's the thing, like, stuff that you perceive as original, it's actually kind of I like to think of writing ideas kind of like in a molecular sense, where you combine, like, each writing idea that has been done before, like each major trope, you can kind of break down into one element, for example, and when you compile them together to form a new compound, that's kind of like a new idea. For example, Game of Thrones is kind of like The Sopranos meets Middle Earth, and those are the two baser elements. And if you look at Lord of the Rings, it is comprised of myriad ideas that have been done and explored. But Tolkien went to so many different lengths to find things to incorporate into his world that he was building that it basically defined the fantasy genre on its own. I believe Lord of the Rings was originally classified as science fiction because there was no fantasy.
Yeah,
heading in a
The
bookshelf.
Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, he basically made those genres. And you can
Yeah,
really see the influence
did.
with early fiction being so focused on world building.
Yep.
That actually plays a lot into how writing has evolved over the years. It used to be in like the 18 and early 1900s, earlier than the 1800s up until basically photography, where stories might spend an entire chapter at the beginning of the book just setting the scene of the story with the landscape, because the readers couldn't get that anywhere else.
Exactly.
They didn't travel. They didn't have the closest thing. They didn't have pictures. They didn't have the internet. The closest thing they had was paintings, which are very expensive and were usually one specific scene, or a lot of times were just a person. And so books were how they experienced this difference. Well, we don't see a lot of those books anymore because now we have everything else that shows a world better. I mean, you can try to write.
People have seen a picture of a rainforest, so
yeah,
you don't have to spend as much detail.
It's easier to describe, and other mediums do it better.
Exactly. To finish answering the question, I guess a lot of the reason why people want to be original and kind of go off and do their own thing is because they're like, well, this has already been done before. I want to do something new. I've got to, be like so and so. I've got to, revolutionize or whatever. And you do revolutionize by trying something new, but oftentimes it's just recompiling things, like old things, in a way which is new. And there's also stories that have been retold time and time again that are different and unique and compelling because of the person telling them. Like, if Pico and I were to write the exact same story with the exact same premise, you get two completely different stories because we're different people with different strengths and weaknesses as authors, and that alone can be originality. Like, if you just have an original way of saying the same sentence as somebody else, then boom, you have originality. And I guess that's kind of return to an original telling of a story, just kind of embracing that. I guess this is kind of a bit of the principles of postmodernism, where the whole philosophy of postmodernism is like everything that can possibly have been thought of has been done. So now, in order to be original, we have to just reuse stuff in a unique way.
I do like the metaphor of elements, just because, like, for example, TV tropes exist because because there are until we start getting some new and different things in the world of science or whatnot, because that's where stories come from, is you're inspired by something or you get a little tidbit of something.
Mm-hmm.
But
well, the thing is, going back to the basic question, why is there an obsession over telling an original story? One of the big reasons is, if you've seen a story before, you have a huge it affects how you see future stories. People want to write stuff that's original because they want to interest people, make them think. It can help you get a lot more readers, which is what a lot of people are after, as opposed to telling the same romance, over and over and over. But at the same time, there are instances where, especially in the professional romance book industry, where if you go to a publisher to try and publish a romance, it's so predefined that some even have specific page counts that you have to be close to. And so, depending on the medium you're looking for, I think my power's about to go out.
And I was totally going to mention that we talked about, like, I don't know how far you guys got on or off topic or to the next question, I don't know. But I was going to mention that, like, we talked a lot about originality in the last Teacher's Lounge.
Oh, okay.
So.
Yeah, the thing about originality is that it's largely about...
Well, we should probably save this conversation for when we're recording again.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yes, I turned the recording back on.
All right, when did I drop off? Because I was in the middle of a thought.
You were talking about how 50% of the romance thing is...
Oh, yeah. Pico, what statement of mine did you last hear?
I commented after your last statement. So, where did you drop off?
Did you get the part where I said romance accounts for literally half of the book sales?
No, I didn't.
Okay, yeah, I was gonna... Oh, I remember. I was bouncing off what you said about the romance formula, is that if you do not follow that romance formula to a T, for example, like, say... Okay, the romance formula, this isn't... don't quote me on this one, because this is just off the top of my head, but, like, say they have to kiss by chapter 3. And if they don't kiss by chapter 3, you've broken the romance formula. And obviously, love has to win out in the end, all this sort of thing. There's a really complex formula you can look up, and by reading a few romance novels. But if you don't follow it to a T, your story's not romance. It's a romantic story, or a story with romance in it, but it's not a romance.
Yeah, and it changes a little bit from publisher to publisher. But
it does too, But the romance formula, category romance is what it's called, accounts for about half of book sales, and that's following this really stringent formula. That's actually why romance writers like, Stephen King, he's really prolific. He writes 2,000 words a day, and that's more than double of what the average professional writer puts out. But romance writers are like, yeah, I had a slow day. I only wrote 10,000 because they're so formulaic. You can just pour words out way quicker once you're used to it.
Once you get decent at it, yeah.
Once you get good, yeah.
And a large part of that for the book sales is romance writers read a lot more used books. So the used book industry, that's why one of the largest sections they have is usually romance, is because the romance gets recycled a lot more, whereas new book sales, romances might do well, but it's not as well proportionally compared to used.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I'm here now.
Yay!
The one other thing I would maybe add to the original telling thing is there is a certain allure to originality. It's like the first one, you hold the patent. It's like so much success in the world is based around, are you the one that came up with it first?
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, you should never be disgruntled or disappointed by retelling an old story really well.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And changing elements around, changing characters is a big part of that.
Yeah.
Like we mentioned in our last episode, the hero's journey is a very old, very overused trope/story.
But it's still like one of the most compelling
it's still
stories.
one of the most compelling stories ever. Star Wars, for the love of God, was a hero's journey. Like the first Star Wars was the hero's journey.
Yeah, that's all it was, and
they used a lot of elements even
right.
taken from other stories.
Yeah,
There's
the
an
difference
interesting
between,
combination.
Originality and like ripping people off, and this is where a lot of new writers might stumble. Is going back to my elements metaphor, is that say Lord of the Rings is one element. If you only incorporate Lord of the Rings and pretty much nothing else into your story, it's like a Lord of the Rings ripoff. But if you did what George R. R. Martin did, it's like, okay, Lord of the Rings plus Sopranos. And a lot of what I'm going to do is based on the Dark Ages, because he's like
a specific war in history too
to fuel that. So those three prime elements are melded together to create the compound that is the Song of Ice and Fire.
Mm-hmm.
And now that has become its own element on its own because it's just so.
And the way he told the story was a lot different as well. It wasn't just the story itself that was different; it was how he told it. The fact that so many of his characters that people loved died was very new to a lot of people. And when things are new, and there's two things in the human brain that really create stimulation: things that are new and interesting, and things that are. My speakers are next to my phone, which is a bad thing. And so it's things that are new and things that are familiar. That's why in music you tend to see specific formulas in certain genres, because the way that it's set up. The third section of the song will be similar to the previous section in terms of the tune and everything, but suddenly the words have changed or an instrument has changed or been added. That newness intrigues the person, and at the same time, the familiarity is reassuring.
And also the one thing too, like with Lord of the Rings could be interpreted as the hero's journey. It could be. Except for the fact that one, Tolkien took so much from other sources, including the Bible. He took a lot of stuff out of the Bible, but then he also took stuff from one of his one of his close friends who wrote the Chronicles of Narnia. He took a lot of what he wrote and also made it his own too. And people don't seem to get that a lot of the stuff Tolkien wrote was never published. Like we said in our last episode, he didn't publish a lot of what he wrote. And
the Silmarillion wasn't really a book either. It was just kind of like background notes.
Yeah. And I think CGP Grey pointed out in his Lord of the Rings video that Lord of the Rings takes place after the epic confrontation happens.
Yep.
It didn't. Lord of the Rings, the epic confrontation between that world's god had already happened, and the world is now suffering the consequences of that. And you're literally just going on a minor journey in a world that's already kind of screwed.
Exactly.
Where, unlike say with our world, if you're going to go off the Christian idea, our world's epic confrontation happened, but we still had a bunch more epic confrontations afterward. So,
But yeah, like
like World War One is an example. World War One would be the epic confrontation, but then a few years later we had World War Two.
yep.
So,
And then a few years later, we had the Korean War and Vietnam, which were a lot smaller and a lot less significant, but still to the people involved. And that's the thing is when it's who you focus on really. You can tell.
That's why war stories, especially with My Little Pony, are really, really, really hard to do correctly. But if you do it correctly, you're going to get a lot of views because they're really, really like. It's a new concept because no one does them right, really.
If you look at Ender's Game, he wrote a lot of other follow-ups to Ender's Game that were basically, if I recall, other characters' perspectives of literally the exact same story. And where Ender's Game did really well being very original in a lot of respects, the other stories were basically the same thing, but the different perspective is what people liked.
Yeah, like you could write a novella where the novella is basically, say it's a 6-hour party at someone's house and there's a lot of people invited, and each chapter is a different attendee of that party, and you'd get 6 completely different tellings of it if you chose 6 people, but you could basically make a novella out of that.
It's like, it was the most awesome party ever, and it's like, I will never forget that night I was raped. For the next character.
Yeah. And multiple points of view works really well in most story ideas. I think the only idea it really doesn't work well in is horror, and that's just because switching characters in horror is really hard to do correctly. But let's go to the next question because we're spending a lot of time on this one.
Well, I believe this is our last question, and this kind of ties back to...
Oh, did you guys already answer the one I had?
Oh, yeah, that's right. We never got around to yours.
Yeah.
You disappeared.
I'm looking at it. I'm trying to understand what it's asking.
Well, I think that's the main reason I was saying that Gary should probably talk about it. But basically,
I can.
With writing lacking sound, how do you avoid pitfalls of repeated use of Discord speech to fragmented, too fragmented, too chaotic to understand, or irrelevant? If the speech started 5 sentences ago by Lisa Eclair, and I think what he's asking, or she's asking, is how do you avoid how do you avoid your characters talking for too long? How do you avoid using Discord speech? Like, how do you avoid using too much of it? I
would almost classify this as Discord doesn't ramble really, but Pinkie Pie does.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is actually kind of why I'm glad I got this, because when I first became a professor at the school, the first thing I wrote was how to write Pinkie Pie. And it was because I had read a story where they had Pinkie Pie break the fourth wall every goddamn chapter. And that's a problem. Because, as I said, Pinkie Pie, and I'm gonna pull it up, but while I'm talking, but Pinkie Pie is a character just the same as any other character in the show. She's a main character, and she's not shown to have any of the special powers in the show. It is literally people misinterpreting it and thinking that she has insert special power here. I'm trying to find the how many words should you have.
And doing it once will maybe get a giggle as long as you don't focus on it as a major plot event. It's like I'm guilty of doing it once in past sins for the play, but that's as I touched it and I left it. It's just like that was it.
I think.
See,
this is why it's making me mad, because someone commented on my how to write Pinkie Pie thing, and now it's like sitting there. It is. So basically, what I said is Pinkie Pie is who is Pinkie Pie, and that isn't a good question to ask. We have to ask what Pinkie Pie is. And Pinkie Pie is Pinkie Pie, but what she isn't is a device to break the fourth wall. She isn't always going to be your slapstick comic relief whore, and she isn't always going to be funny.
WHRSE, horse.
Yeah. You have to understand that you have to understand that and transcend that so that you may write her properly. But basically, one of the things that people do a lot, you have to look at how she acts in the show and use that. You can't use Pinkie Pie is one of the, like with Pinkie Pie and Discord. Discord's the opposite of Pinkie Pie in this respect. You cannot use Pinkie Pie's fandom interpretation.
Nope. You have to
If
use
you
the
use her
show.
fandom interpretation, you will be using Pinkie Pie wrong. It is the opposite with Discord. With Discord, you should not be using his in-show interpretation. You should be using his fandom interpretation or your own interpretation of Discord. And the main reason for that is because Pinkie Pie is Pinkie Pie, and she has a character interpretation that's spot on in the show, but in the fandom, her interpretation is skewed and mixed up. And no one really knows what the hell she is. Discord is Pinkie Pie's fandom interpretation, but in the show. Basically, Discord is a much better character in fandom than he is in the actual show because the fandom interprets him different than the writers of the show do.
Well, and a large
not
reason
really sure
for
I'd
that
agree with
is
that.
Discord
That's
was
just
based
me.
off of Q from Star Trek.
Yeah.
And so,
Well, the
and
main
that's
thing-
great. It made it for an interesting character.
The main reason I was saying the way I'm saying it, Gary, is because Discord in fandom most of the time is a lot less random and more cynical than in the show, compared to in the show where he is used more for comic relief and is more comedic and more random. And that's why I was saying that you use my voice cracked. That's weird. I'm 20 years old. Why did it do that? You use Pinkie Pie. You use Discord. I like to use Discord's fan interpretation better because he's much easier to write based off the fandom than based off the show, because the show doesn't have the overarching headcanon and all that other crap that goes with Discord. But
not to mention the fact that he's mostly visual gags in the
Yeah.
show.
Mhm.
And
which
in the
does
show,
work well in writing.
as this thing said, he is mostly Discord speech and visual gag, while in the fandom, he's more of a, and I hate using the term God because Discord isn't, he's a spirit, but he's more like that God from Skyrim that pisses people off.
Another way
with
to look at
Flabberjack.
this is that Discord is very random, whereas Pinkie is very directed. She might break the wall, she might do some stuff, but it's a very specific thing at the time. It's very planned out. Discord is not. But it's very hard to write Discord because it's so random, because that medium doesn't carry over to the written medium
That's
well.
also-
Whereas
that's
Pinkie
also
Pie does
why-
because it's very specific. So you want to stay with that with Pinkie.
That's
Yeah.
also why with Discord, people when they fananize him, I guess, when people write Discord into fan fiction, he's a lot, as I pointed out, he's a lot more cynical, and
He's deeper as a character.
he's deeper as a character, and he represents chaos better than he does in the actual show, because people's ideas of chaos, the idea of chaos is different from a writer's perspective than a show's perspective and a little kid's perspective.
There's a famous
Because
phrase.
a little kid's perspective of chaos is, oh, random crap going around everywhere. That's literally why
Yeah.
Discord is the way he is.
The best way
Chaos
to a really good way to characterize chaos is what is chaos to the fly is perfectly normal for the spider.
No, chaos is blood for the blood god, skulls for the skull throne. There we go.
Oh,
But
God.
no, but on a more back on topic note, chaos, back on topic for Discord anyway, chaos is different for an adult sense, which is the majority of fanfic, compared to a child sense. And that's the reason why I said writers should stick to the way that you interpret Discord compared to how the show has Discord represented.
At the same time, you need to be accurate, but going back, because we strayed way off topic. To kind of bring it back, my advice is kind of echoing what I said earlier in terms of how do you avoid all these pitfalls when with the dialogue and overdoing it. It's just, you really need to visualize your scene and what happens regarding the dialogue, and really figure out how to parse it in such a way that it actually works. And once it's parsed correctly, you can get away with a lot more, as long as it's parsed properly.
I think a good thing for dialogue is that you need to know the points that you want to hit in the dialogue, like the topics that you want to be discussed and the conclusions you want to be reached. Once you have those, hit those, and do almost nothing more unless it's to add to character personality or relationship or whatever. But that will help you to filter it down, keep it interesting, give it a nice flow between ideas, and that'll work.
Again, writing spec scripts helped me a lot with this.
The main thing you have to avoid when doing dialogue, and I end up falling into this pitfall a lot, and this necessarily doesn't apply to your Discord speech like you were wondering, but run-on sentences suck. Don't go for them. And
Nope.
like if you use run-on sentences, you need to reread your story and figure out what to get rid of. But the other problem that I see a lot of newer writers, and I still do it from time to time, change up a lot of the words you use, especially when it comes to action. Don't say Pinkie Pie bounced one sentence, and then a few sentences later say Pinkie Pie bounced again. You know?
Though, counterpoint to that is don't get caught too much up in setisms.
Yeah.
It's like it's kind of the counterintuitive where if you are going to say that a character said something, generally you can just say Twilight said. You don't have to do Twilight elaborated or Twilight snirked or Twilight. It's
Generally
like,
says...
and I'm guilty of this a bit myself, but I'm trying to get better. But
I think that's one of the things
yeah.
I ripped on Past Tense for, is it did that way. It had way too many setisms.
Yeah,
At least
and
early
like
on.
you don't like setisms. You don't really need to use. You can just say you have the quote, and then you describe what the character does. You don't have to say this character said or this
Exactly.
character asked or whatever.
And you also need to point out too, with like if you cut your sentence in half, say like one character talks and then space, describe what they did, then have them continue talking. You don't necessarily have to say Twilight said at the end of that, because we already established Twilight was doing something while she talked.
Yeah, we've established she's the subject of the paragraph.
Like if you follow Fanfiction's rule that they have for their writing, which irritates me when people break it, when a character talks, you make a new space. And
oh, I hate that.
That really does help people. Like I get irritated because I started reading fanfiction.net and they don't have that rule. And basically that helps.
It just turns into a wall of text at that point.
Yeah, it turns into a wall of text, and that helps people understand who's talking. And that's why you normally don't want to have more than one character talking on the same paragraph. And it's a good rule to have going on.
Yeah, whenever a new character talks, it's a new paragraph. There are very few exceptions to that rule. I've seen it done, but it's really hard to do properly.
And I double space because I'm in college and it's required, and I've gotten into the habit of doing it. So with me, I'll normally just double space my paragraphs, and people get annoyed by it, but it helps me figure out where the hell I am in my story when I write.
You either double, like, as in hit return twice.
Yeah,
but if you hit return twice, you don't indent your paragraphs. But I indent my paragraphs, but only hit return once, because the indent signifies a new paragraph.
And that becomes a personal taste of whichever you feel is better. Personally, I feel the indent is better for written, printed text that you're actually reading on a page, where the double space works better for internet viewing.
The thing to keep in mind with a physical book compared to an online publication is cost. There's a reason why it's really recommended in professional stories to go through when you're done with the book and try to cut out 10% of the words. It helps focus the story more, but it also cuts down on cost of printing, which can be a huge restriction for a lot of people to be that certain price point. It just happens to have extra benefits. I tend to find that not double spacing and indenting works better for longer chapters, whereas having shorter chapters, it kind of works to space it out more because it feels a little bit longer, but it's actually not. Whereas with a longer story or longer chapters, having those spaces taken out helps it feel a little bit more manageable.
And before we move on to the next question, and I actually have to go after I finish iterating this because I have some stuff I have to do. One thing that really helps, and I actually just found this out in college today, or the other day, when I'm in History 101, and my teacher was telling us how she wants the papers done, like how she wants all the papers done, the requirements and all that stuff. And one of the things she said, was, you need to read it on your computer, type it up, read it on your computer, and then if you have a printer and if you have the ability to do it, print it, read it, and then mark out anything that you missed when you were reading on your computer. Because she points out that she said it's a lot easier to print off it's easier to read it on your computer, edit what's obvious, but then it's a lot harder to pay attention to what's not obviously wrong with your paper when it's on your computer screen, because you won't be able to read it as well as if you had the physical copy in your hand.
Well, that's something I always advocate. Like, like in creative writing class, you actually are almost always required to print out and bring hard copies of everything to the class, and you edit with pen and paper. Like, always edit with pen and paper.
That's also why with comparing a physical copy of a book to an e-copy of a book, there are some things that a lot of people miss in a story. Like I was reading Percy Jackson on an ebook in school, and I got the physical copy of the book after I was done reading it, and I read it again, and there was a lot of stuff that I missed because of the e-copy of the book and just the way it was formatted.
There are differences between the two, and like for me personally, I love the physical copy of a book better, but like the electronic version has certain convenience and other benefits. But
well, like with even then, like comparing a phone to a computer screen, I read Fallout Equestria and Past Sins when I was flying to Dubai. I needed something to read and I didn't want to buy any books, so I was like, okay, well, I'm going to download Past Sins, Fallout Equestria, and that should last me for 2 weeks. And I finished Past Sins in like 2 hours, but it took me the entire trip to finish Fallout Equestria because one, Past Sins I had already read like 4 times, and then Fallout Equestria I hadn't touched. I'd always wanted to read it, but I never touched it, and so it took me longer to read it. When I got home, I read Fallout. I finished Fallout Equestria in Dubai, but I reread it on my computer, and I missed a lot of stuff because comparing the tiny phone screen to the big ass computer screen.
Yeah. Well, I think we covered the question pretty much.
Yeah.
We're already on other
and
stuff.
Also,
so
just gonna point out, if we didn't answer this question, just leave a comment in the post when we post the video,
and we'll use it as another, perhaps more clarified question to answer in the next video. So
anyway, I'm gonna get going, guys. So
all right, have a good one.
See you, Dart.
Yep. Nice meeting you, Penstroke and Gary.
No worries.
Nice meeting you too, sir.
All right. So we're down to one question. So. And it's one we've kind of addressed already, but we can try to talk about it one more time in this very specific context. But how do you write a mystery without making it too easy to solve, but not impossible to solve? This kind of goes back to foreshadowing and all the stuff we talked about earlier about having red herrings, having the way the characters interpret things. For mystery novels in particular, writing out the whole story so you have the whole mystery laid out. But the one additional thing I would say to the mystery novel is that you do want to make sure the mystery itself is enticing. Just because when someone is reading a story that is marked as a mystery novel, they are wanting to really kind of be along, trying to solve the thing. And if it's something that they themselves feel is a mundane mystery, like where's my glasses or something like that, then they lose interest in the story. But if you can but that's not saying that you can't make a story that's interesting about where's my glasses. They just have to be really darn special glasses.
Yeah, that's true. Writing mysteries is inherently just really difficult because I took a genre fiction class a couple years ago, and one of the things we were doing was mystery writing, and my professor who's actually published a couple of mystery novels, I believe, what she does when she writes those is she has to like get all these color-coded index cards, and she writes things on the index cards based on like, okay, each index card represents a character or a setting or whatever, and kind of lays them all out in front of her, and it's just this really intricately woven story, just because, like, you know, you have to be intellectually stimulating. Things all have to add up and make sense. And the readers, the appeal, as you said, of mysteries is you read them and you try and solve them and engage yourself with the story and see if you can figure it out yourself. And
the butler did it.
Yeah, it has,
and like
it has
one
to
of the
work.
things about mysteries is that you're approaching some significant event from outside of that significant event. And so what you need to do, like the basic formula for a mystery is you have the thing happen. You have the solution to the mystery, and you can look at what clues you want to scatter where, but you need to have the important event be happening or already have happened and have the main character and your other characters not be involved in that. And so you'll probably end up writing an entire story about this crazy thing that some mass murderer did or whatever. And you may need to have all the details of that written out. And then you can just pick and choose what parts of those you want the characters to run into or to get glances of, but you want your characters to do the same things we talked about when it came to foreshadowing. You want them to misinterpret it, and there will be red herrings, of course, and that is what adds to the mystery, is that the things link up. And you as a writer, when you're writing, I don't know what it is, but like if you already know what's going on, there will be some of the anticipation of the discovery will bleed into your own writing through that, because you
It'll be
are
implicit,
anticipating.
yeah.
Yeah. And
but
so
one thing
the style will come out, and it will come together in the end really nicely. That's just the basic formula, but there are other things that can help to make it
There is an
better.
important thing that you can't overlook, though, and that's if you're writing a mystery, you have to know stuff like police procedure. Because if it's an important case you have to solve, like a murder or a theft or whatever, it's going to be handled by the police. And because it's handled by the police, you have to know, like, okay, depending on the crime, what are they going to, like, who are they going to put on the case? Is it going to be, like, an officer or detective or whatever? And what procedures do they have to follow? Like, what are the rules?
Well,
And you have to do a crap
That
ton of
only
research.
applies to a crime mystery.
Yeah, you can
have like, the police are generally going to be involved if it's a murder, but if you have it as like the daughter is trying to solve the mystery 10 years after the fact or something.
Yeah, there's a difference.
Or you could have another mystery where like the police are like corrupt and they're paid off by the guy who's doing the crimes, kind of thing. Then you have to have a character that can't rely on that kind of stuff, and that also happens to work as well. Like there's a game called Life is Strange where that's basically what happens.
Like, Ponies lets you circumvent this a bit, but you still are behooved to know, like, to do some research based on, like, how stuff's actually handled when it comes to this.
There's a big thing I think we need to mention, and that's that there are two different kinds of mysteries. One is a mystery through obfuscation. Basically, a entity, some intelligence has specifically obscured something or done something in such a way as the solution needs to be found. That's the objective of the entire story. And the other is kind of like a discovery mystery. For instance, you can have a sci-fi story where it's a wreck in space. It may not have been a person that caused the wreck, but you have to figure out what's going on. Fall of Equestria actually did this really well with a couple of the stables, where something went wrong in the stable and they have to figure it out. It's a smaller story within a larger story, but it's a story about this more naturally occurring mystery that happened, but it's a lot different than if a specific character has done something and you have to figure out what they did. And how you address that is different. There are very few murder-style mysteries in the Pony fandom. One that I edited for that was really good was Under a Luminous Sky by Jake the Army Guy. It's a really good murder mystery. And he had to do a lot of research into the very typical, like the how you're supposed to do a mystery like that, and it has it. So if you want to read a mystery that's a Pony story that does it well, I would recommend that story, and I'll include a link down below.
Yeah, but like when it comes to mysteries, there's a whole bunch of different like tropes that exist. Like you have the bad guy who has his own little pawn guy that begins to take the fall, and like near the end of it, you're thinking it's this one guy that he set up as the pawn, but in the end you discover it's really this one guy who seemed innocent the whole time, kind of crap. And so like when you're writing a mystery, there's a whole bunch of different kind of stuff you can do to make it good, but it's mostly about taking that mystery formula. You can use the formula however you want, but the rest of your writing, the personalities of your characters, the emotional investment, the way you pace the discoveries of clues and events, you still have to do that exactly the same as if you were writing any other story, and you have to do it with the same kind of quality. And that is what will get your readers emotionally invested. You have to have hooks. You have to have something that will keep them invested in the character and in the future of what happens. And so once you've got the formula, once you've put it together, the formula is important for making the mystery really good. But the style of writing, the personality of your characters, and the way that you bring in your reader emotionally get them invested in it, that is all perhaps much more important than the actual mystery itself.
Well, I think we answered that question pretty well.
And that would be the end of our question, so...
So this has been the Teachers Lounge episode number 2. We will include, we've been doing this about once a month, and that's something I think we're going to plan on continuing. So be sure to follow the School for New Writers on Fanfiction. It is one of the more popular groups, so it should be easy for you to find. And I will include a link down below. Big thanks to Gary Oak and Penstroke, who, while they're not teachers, they have done a lot of teaching in the fandom, both at conventions and online. And if you guys want to talk for a minute about any conventions you're planning on going to in the future, where you will be doing panels and people can talk to you one-on-one, please take a moment.
You want to go first, Pen? Or shall I?
You go ahead.
Okay, so I don't go to quite as many conventions as Penstroke because I'm from Canada and traveling to the US is kind of costly, but I typically go to 3. Obviously, BronyCon, that's the biggest con in the fandom. I was lucky enough to be a panelist this year, and I was on one of Penstroke's panels. I also ran a How to Write Comedy panel, and I think I did okay enough that I should be able to get invited back as a panelist, but again, fingers crossed, knock on wood. So I should be at BronyCon. Whether or not I'm a panelist, that will be up in the air until probably like 10 months from now. But yeah, here's hoping I get invited to a panel again. I have been on the Everfree Northwest writing track for, 2 years now? So I'm hoping to make that 3 as soon as community guest applications open up again. I'm going to apply for panels and stuff there. I'm not sure who's running it, but hopefully I'll be back there as well. And the third con I go to, not too many people go to this one because it's in Canada, but it's Canada's biggest convention, though. It's for ponies. It's called BronyCan. It's like a convention of about 1,000. It's in Richmond, British Columbia, which is part of Greater Vancouver. I've been running the single writing panel that con has done for the past 3 years now. So yeah, that's definitely a thing, and I intend to go back and run the writing panel at BronyCan again. So that is the gamut of cons I do.
I'm kind of done with the convention circuit for the summer, just because I tend to do it in the summer. I am going to be. I'm not on a panel at EQLA, but I'm going to be heading down for Saturday, just because it's the literally closest convention to where I live in Glendale, California. So, but yeah. Other than that, the ones I tend to frequent are Everfree Northwest, BronyCon, BabsCon. Some of basically the California conventions, and then the big old one up that they have in Baltimore.
I noticed that it's like not really a convention season if you and I haven't been on a panel together, Pen.
So this has been the Teachers Lounge. Thank you for joining us. Again, feel free to subscribe to the Teachers Lounge, and I'll include links to everyone and a few of the places we mentioned and stories we've mentioned down below. Have a good one, every pony.
Bye.
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 Thanks for having me.